In the spring of 2026, the small town of Briarhill was beginning to shake off the last traces of winter. The trees along Main Street had started showing tiny green buds, and people were once again stopping to chat on sidewalks rather than rushing to get out of the cold. Work crews had returned to the long-delayed renovation of the old Whitford Community Hall, a building that had been part of the town for nearly a century. For years, the hall had hosted weddings, charity dinners, dances, and school plays. But time had worn it down. The roof leaked, the floors sagged, and no one had been allowed inside for safety reasons. Everyone in town was excited to finally see it brought back to life. The crew working that morning went about their tasks the way they always did. There was nothing unusual at first. Pipes needed replacing, old wires had to be removed, and sections of wall that had been damaged by water needed to be torn out. But shortly after lunch, when sunlight fell in from the open doorway and lit up the dust in the air, something unexpected happened. One of the workers hit what he thought was a support beam behind a set of old wooden panels. The sound wasn't right. It was hollow, too hollow for a solid beam. Curious, he tapped it again, then called over 2 others. They removed more of the paneling carefully this time, revealing not a beam, but what looked like a false wall. It was smooth and strangely clean, as if someone had installed it with great care long ago. Why would anyone build one of these in a community hall? One of the workers asked. No one had an answer. False walls weren't exactly common in old public buildings. After getting permission from their supervisor, the team widened the opening. The wood cracked and broke away in long pieces. Behind it, something large and dark was sitting silently, almost as if it had been waiting. At first, the workers thought it was just a pile of old furniture. But as the dust settled and more light streamed in, the shape became clearer. A long, curved frame, legs carved with smooth edges, a glossy surface beneath layers of gray dust. It was a grand piano, not an ordinary upright piano like the ones found in school music rooms. This was the kind that once sat on a stage under bright lights. Even covered in dirt and cobwebs, it looked elegant, like a sleeping animal with a quiet kind of dignity. The workers stood staring for several long seconds. None of them had expected anything like this. Who hides a piano? Someone finally said. They had no idea. Word spread almost instantly. In a small town, news moves fast, especially when something strange is discovered. Within an hour, the town council was notified, and curious residents had begun gathering outside the hall, trying to peek through the open doorway. People whispered to one another, each version of the story becoming a little more dramatic than the last. By the time the council members arrived, a small crowd had gathered. A few older residents said they remembered a piano in the hall many decades ago, but none of them recalled it being a grand piano. Others insisted the building had never had one. A couple of teenagers recorded videos on their phones, pointing them toward the doorway as if expecting the piano to suddenly play itself. Inside, the workers carefully brushed dust off the instrument. It was surprisingly well made. Even with years of grime, the wood underneath still showed hints of a deep, rich color. The lid was closed, and no one dared open it yet. They didn't want to damage anything. For all they knew, the piano could be valuable. The workers stepped back when the town council entered the room. The members stared at the piano just as the crew had, unsure of what to make of it. One of them approached slowly and ran a finger gently along the outer edge. Under the dust, the surface was smooth, not cracked like they had expected. It seemed impossible that something stored in such poor conditions could remain in such good shape. Does anyone know where this came from? A council member asked. Everyone shook their heads. No records mentioned anything about a grand piano being stored in the hall. The last renovation, decades earlier, had made no note of it either. And the false wall looked newer than the rest of the interior, suggesting someone had intentionally hidden the piano at some point. The air inside the hall felt different now, not frightening, but full of questions. People were drawn to the piano, not just because it was unexpected, but because it felt like a secret from another time. A mystery placed right in front of them. A decision was made to notify the local historian. She had helped the town uncover many old stories in the past, forgotten letters, maps, even a journal found in the library attic. If anyone could explain why a grand piano had been hidden in the community hall, she could dot while waiting for her arrival. The workers stepped outside, leaving the piano untouched for the moment. The hall felt strangely quiet without them. Sunlight fell through gaps in the boarded windows, creating long, thin shapes on the dusty floor. The piano sat alone, the dust on its surface catching bits of light. A few brave residents stepped just inside the doorway to look. Some stood in silence, almost afraid to get too close. Others whispered questions under their breath, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the thing. There was no logical reason for the uneasiness people felt, but still, the room had changed. The hall had held many memories, dances, concerts, meetings. But now it seemed it held a story no one knew about. A little after 3 in the afternoon, the historian finally arrived. She walked inside with careful steps, her eyes fixed on the piano the moment she saw it. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she moved around it slowly, taking in its shape, its size, the small details of its craftsmanship. She brushed a bit of dust off the front panel and leaned closer. "This isn't an ordinary piano," she said softly. The workers looked at one another. The council leaned in. "It's quite old," she continued, "but whoever owned it must have loved it. They cared for it. Even after so many years, the wood hasn't been ruined. That doesn't happen by accident." She knelt by one of the legs, running her hand along a small carved design that had been hidden by dirt. It was a delicate pattern of leaves and tiny roses. This kind of design was popular in the 1940s, she added. But that's strange. This hall didn't host anything fancy enough to require a piano like this back then. More questions, no answers. She asked one of the workers to lift the lid. He hesitated, but finally did, raising it slowly. Dust floated into the air as the inside was revealed. The keys were dusty, but intact. The strings inside the frame weren't rusted. The hammers hadn't crumbled. The interior looked almost untouched by time. How is that possible? A council member asked. The historian shook her head. "I don't know, but someone must have kept it in good condition before hiding it. Very good condition." She looked again at the false wall. The workers had pulled away most of it by now, leaving behind an outline that showed how carefully it had been constructed. The boards were cut neatly. The nails had been placed with precision. It hadn't been a rushed job. Someone wanted the piano hidden, but protected as more people peeked in from the doorway. The historian asked the workers to check the piano bench. If someone had gone to such effort to hide the piano, they might have left something with it. They carefully opened the bench. Inside lay a stack of old sheet music. The top page was handwritten, the ink faded but still readable. The notes were written with an elegant style, and at the bottom of the page were 2 initials. E.L. Does that mean anything to anyone? Someone asked. No one recognized the initials, but the historian stared at them for a long moment, as though trying to pull a memory from somewhere deep in her mind. "It seems familiar," she finally said, "but I can't place it yet. Outside?" The crowd grew larger as more residents arrived after hearing the news. People speculated, each idea wilder than the last. Some thought the piano had belonged to a traveling musician who'd visited the town long ago. Others believed it was part of a secret performance that had never happened. A few joked that it might be haunted, though the historian quickly dismissed that with a small smile. Still, the mystery had captured everyone's imagination. The workers decided it was best to move the piano out of the hall until the renovation was complete. It would be safer in the town museum, where it could be protected and examined properly. Plans were made to transport it the following morning. As the day came to an end, the hall grew quiet again. The last bit of sunlight filtered across the piano before fading away. Outside, the workers locked up, leaving the building still and silent. Yet something about the discovery lingered in everyone's thoughts as they walked home. It wasn't just that a piano had been found. It was the feeling that the piano had a story to tell, one that had been hidden for a long time. And now, after all those years, it had been found again. The morning after the piano was found, Briar Hill woke up buzzing with excitement. People who normally started their day quietly were suddenly talking with their neighbors, sharing theories, asking questions, and wondering what the historian would discover next. Even those who rarely paid attention to town news felt drawn into the mystery. Something about the forgotten piano made everyone feel like they were part of a story, one unfolding right in front of them. The workers arrived early at the old community hall, ready to move the piano to the museum as planned. They brought large moving blankets, a set of straps, and a wheeled platform to transport it safely. The historian arrived shortly after them. She looked thoughtful, almost distracted, as though she had spent the entire night thinking about the initials found on the sheet music. Before moving the piano, she asked for a few more minutes to examine it. She walked around it slowly, touching the edges with gentle fingers, studying the curve of the wood, the grooves in the legs, and the tiny scratches that hinted at its long history. She seemed to be searching for something, though she wasn't even sure what. The workers waited patiently. None of them minded. They were curious, too. The piano felt special, not just because of where it had been found, but because it had clearly been important to someone in the past. The historian finally stepped back and nodded to the workers. "Let's take it to the museum," she said softly. "We'll learn more when we can study it properly." The team moved slowly and carefully. The piano was heavy, but they lifted it together, step by step, placing it onto the wheeled platform. It rolled smoothly across the floor, almost as if it was relieved to finally be moving after so many silent years. A few residents had gathered outside the hall again, even though it was early. When they saw the piano being brought out, they stepped aside respectfully. Some whispered to one another. Others simply watched in quiet fascination. The workers guided the piano toward a large truck designed for delicate transport. The historian walked alongside it, keeping a close eye on every movement. She didn't want anything to happen to it. Not after it had survived so much. It took only a few minutes to load the piano into the truck. Once it was secured, the historian climbed into her car, and the workers followed in their vehicles. A small caravan formed, and several residents even drove behind them. Eager to see the piano's new temporary home, the museum was located at the center of town, inside an old brick building that had once been a courthouse. It wasn't large, but it was filled with memories, photographs, artifacts, letters, and objects from different eras of Briar Hill's history. The piano would be the newest addition, though no one knew yet what story it would tell. As soon as they arrived, the workers carefully unloaded the piano and rolled it inside. They placed it in a dedicated room where the historian kept her research materials. The sunlight coming through the tall windows made the dust on the piano sparkle faintly, giving it an almost magical look. The historian thanked the workers, and they eventually left, leaving her alone in the quiet room with the piano. She closed the door gently and took a long breath. Now came the part she had been waiting for. She sat down on a small stool and opened the piano lid fully. Dust rose into the air again, forming thin clouds around her. She brushed off the keys one by one with a soft cloth. Strangely, many of them were still smooth, and not nearly as worn as she would have expected from such an old instrument. She pressed one key lightly. A soft note floated through the room. Not perfect, but surprisingly clear. She pressed another, then another, forming a simple tune. The sound wasn't sharp or broken. It was gentle, warm, and slightly aged, like something full of memories. She couldn't believe it. How could a piano hidden for so many years still play like this? After testing a few more notes, she closed the lid carefully and reached for the sheet music found in the piano bench. The pages were fragile, yellowed at the edges, and written in a style she hadn't seen in a long time. Each stroke of ink felt personal, thoughtful, and precise. She studied the initials again, Ela, as though they held a secret she had just missed the first time. Who was this person? Someone who wrote music by hand. Someone who owned a beautiful grand piano. Someone who cared enough to hide it, to protect it, to leave it intact for future generations. The historian turned the pages slowly, reading the titles of the pieces. Some were simple, perhaps written during the early years of learning. Others looked more complex, filled with flowing notes and shifting rhythms. One title caught her eye, Homeward. The handwriting seemed slightly different, as if written during a moment of strong emotion. She stared at the title for a long time. Something about it tugged at her heart. She placed the sheet music down gently and walked to the museum's storage shelves, where old town records were kept. Thick binders, dusty books, and stacks of documents were arranged in rows. She searched through the ones from the 1940s. Hoping for a clue, she spent nearly an hour flipping through records, checking names, reading notes from old town meetings, scanning lists of performances held in the community hall over the years. There were entries about plays, charity shows, small concerts by local musicians, but none mentioned a grand piano. That struck her as strange. An instrument like that would not have gone unnoticed. Eventually, she found a small notebook filled with faded newspaper clippings. She brought it back to the table and began sifting through them. Some were hard to read, but she took her time. One clipping made her pause. It was a small article, tucked into the corner of an old page. A black and white photo showed a young woman sitting at a piano, not the same one, but a similar style. She was smiling in the picture, her posture straight, her eyes bright. She looked full of life. Under the photo was a short sentence. Local pianist gives heartfelt performance at the town hall. The clipping didn't include the pianist's full name, only the initials. E.L. The historian felt a chill. She stared at the article again. The date was from the mid-1940s. The timing matched the style of the sheet music. It was the first piece of evidence connecting the initials to a real person. She dug deeper into the notebook, searching for more. She found 2 other clippings, each mentioning a pianist with the same initials. One described a performance to raise funds for families affected by the war. Another talked about a special event where the pianist played a composition she had written herself. The historian leaned back in her chair, feeling a small spark of excitement. She was getting closer to something. A real story. A real person. Outside the room, the museum was quiet. The sound of footsteps from visitors faded in and out as they walked through other parts of the building. But in this room, time felt slower, as if waiting for her to uncover the truth. She returned to the piano and examined it once more, this time with fresh eyes. She looked at every detail, the carvings on the legs, the texture of the wood, the slight dents near the keyboard where someone had once rested their hands. Each mark felt like a trace of the past. She wondered what the pianist had been like, what her life had been like, why she stopped performing, and most importantly, Why she hid the piano. The historian knew she needed more information. She planned to search the town's library next, as well as the archives in City Hall. Perhaps old letters, diaries, or property records would reveal more. Before leaving the room, she pressed one last key on the piano. The note lingered softly, filling the room with a quiet warmth. As she walked out, she locked the door behind her. The piano remained inside, glowing faintly under the afternoon light. Meanwhile, outside the museum, people continued talking about the discovery. They stood in small groups, sharing their own theories. Some thought the piano belonged to a famous musician who had passed through town. Others imagined it was part of a love story. A few believed it was hidden because of money or war, or a family secret that no one knew for sure. But everyone felt something important was unfolding. Later that afternoon, a group of children pressed their faces against the museum windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of the piano. They couldn't see much, but even the idea of it excited them. They had heard adults talking about it all day. The whole town seemed to hum with curiosity. As evening settled in, the historian returned home with a stack of photocopied documents she had taken from the museum shelves. She placed them on her table and began reading through them again. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. Something small but important. She read the clippings again and again, studying the blurred faces in the photos, the shapes of the letters, the places mentioned. Finally, late at night, she closed her eyes and let out a long breath. There was a story here, a story, waiting to be told, and the piano, silent for so many years, was ready to tell it. The historian knew she was only at the beginning. Whatever truth lay behind the initials, EL would take time to uncover. But she felt determined, almost pulled toward it by something she couldn't explain. The piano had been hidden with care. Now it had been found with wonder. The next steps would reveal why. The next morning came with a soft gray sky hanging over Briar Hill, the kind that made everything feel quiet and thoughtful. The historian woke early, still thinking about the piano and the initials written on the sheet music. She felt a strange pull toward the story, as though the piano itself was asking her to keep searching. After a quick breakfast, she headed straight back to the museum. The town was beginning to buzz again. People walking their dogs paused to chat. Others gathering outside the bakery pointed toward the museum, clearly wondering whether anything new had been discovered overnight. The piano had become the center of everyone's curiosity. Inside the museum, the air felt cool and calm. She unlocked the door to the room where the piano sat. The moment she stepped inside, she felt that same quiet energy she had felt the day before, something soft, steady, almost peaceful. The piano stood in the sunlight coming through the tall windows. Dust floated gently in the air, giving the room a warm glow. It looked almost alive, as though it had finally woken up after years of silence. The historian set her bag down and pulled out the documents she had brought home. She arranged them neatly on the table, then turned her attention back to the piano. There was still so much she didn't know. She approached it slowly, taking in every detail again. The carvings on the legs, the shape of the frame, the slight curve of the lid. Even the faint scratches near the keyboard seemed meaningful now. She opened the piano bench again, looking through the sheet music more carefully this time. There were several pages, some handwritten, some printed, all faded with age. But something about the handwriting pieces stood out. They felt personal. One page had a tiny smudge in the corner, as though someone had touched it with a thumb while lost in thought. Another had a faint pencil mark, maybe from practicing. These small signs made her feel strangely connected to the person who had written them. She noticed a piece of music at the very bottom of the stack, one she hadn't examined yet. It wasn't part of the other sheets. It was folded in half, tucked away as if someone wanted it hidden. Carefully, she opened it. Inside was a short melody, only a few lines long. The handwriting looked shakier than the others, almost as if written during an emotional moment. At the bottom, instead of initials, there was a date that surprised her. It was written several years after the other pieces. She whispered to herself, why would she write this later? She didn't know yet, but she felt sure it mattered. As she placed the sheet aside, she noticed something else, something she hadn't seen before. There was a small gap along the inside edge of the piano frame, just barely visible when the piano lid was open. It looked too even to be a crack. Her heart picked up slightly. She leaned closer. The gap ran along the inner curve of the wood, looking almost like a seam, a hidden seam. She reached for a small wooden tool from her bag, the kind she used when examining older objects. Gently, she pressed the edge of it into the seam. Click. The sound was soft, but unmistakable. The panel shifted. She froze for a moment, not believing what had just happened. Then, with both hands, she carefully slid the hidden panel open. Inside was a small compartment lined with deep red velvet. The color had faded over time, but the texture was still soft. Lying inside the compartment were several old items. Her breath caught. There were letters folded, sealed, preserved. There were concert tickets from the 1940s, and there was a black and white photograph. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the photograph. In the picture, a young woman sat proudly beside a grand piano. The same piano. She wore a simple dress and had a gentle smile, the kind that reached her eyes. The room behind her looked full, like a concert was about to begin. The historian stared at the photograph for a long time. Something about the woman felt familiar, though she couldn't say why. She placed the photograph on the table and then carefully opened one of the letters. The paper was fragile, and the ink had faded, but the words were still readable. The letter began with a greeting symbol, warm, and then it continued into a description of the woman's music, her performances, and her dreams. It was written by someone who cared for her deeply, someone who had watched her play. The historian's eyes moved quickly across the page, trying to absorb every detail. She felt as though she was being pulled into the past. Each letter seemed to paint more of a picture. The woman in the photograph had been a talented pianist, widely admired in the town. Her performances had brought people together, lifting spirits during difficult times. She had written her own music, pouring her heart into each note. But then, something changed. One letter mentioned her stepping back from performing. Another talked about her becoming more private. A third described her spending long hours alone with the piano, playing the same piece again and again. The historian felt a wave of sadness wash over her. Something had happened to the pianist, something that had changed her life completely. She reached into the compartment again and found a final letter, sealed with a faded piece of ribbon. She hesitated before opening it. This one felt different. When she finally unfolded it, she took in a slow breath. The handwriting looked softer, less controlled, almost as though written in a moment of heartbreak. The letter explained why the piano had been hidden. The pianist had faced a deep loss, one that took away her strength to perform. Music had become painful for her, a reminder of something she couldn't bear to relive. And so, rather than part with the piano, she hid it carefully, lovingly where only time could touch it. She wrote that she couldn't bring herself to destroy it or give it away. It held too many memories, too many moments of joy, sadness, hope, and love. The historian closed her eyes for a moment. The story was heavier than she expected. Softer, too. It wasn't a story of fame or fortune. It was a human story, full of emotion and choices. When she opened her eyes again, she studied the items in the compartment once more. The photograph, the letters, the tickets. They all felt like pieces of a life lived quietly but deeply. She placed everything on the table in an organized row. These items would help her understand who the pianist truly was. Just then, there was a gentle knock on the door. The museum's curator peeked in. "Everything all right?" The historian nodded slowly. "Yes, but I think we just discovered something important." The curator stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the open compartment. He stared in surprise. There was a hidden space inside the piano? She nodded again. And someone used it to keep these safe. He leaned closer, examining the photograph. "That must be her." "I think so," the historian said. "But we still don't know her name. Just her initials." They both stared at the photograph for a long moment. The woman looked so alive, so full of promise. It was hard to imagine her hiding her piano away and withdrawing from the world. What happened to her? The curator asked quietly. "I'm not sure," the historian admitted, "but I want to find out." She gently gathered the letters and placed them in protective sleeves. She did the same with the concert tickets. The photograph she handled with extra care, sliding it into a clear archival envelope. Once everything was safe, she turned her attention back to the piano. She touched the inside of the compartment again. The velvet was soft but warm. Whoever created this space had done it with great care. She closed the compartment gently. The panel slid into place with a soft click, as though it had never been opened. The historian stepped back and took in the entire scene. The piano no longer felt like an abandoned object. It felt like a heartbeat from the past. A vessel carrying memories. She sat down at the small stool and placed her hands on the keys. She didn't press them yet. She simply rested her fingers there, imagining the pianist doing the same decades ago. Then, with a soft touch, she played a slow, simple melody. The music filled the room. Soft and warm. It felt like an echo of the pianist's past. When the last note faded, she whispered, "We'll find your story." Outside the room, the museum remained quiet, but the story was growing, piece by piece. The historian gathered her notes and prepared for the next step. The hidden compartment had given her new clues, ones that would guide her search. The pianist had lived, loved, performed, and eventually chosen silence. Now, it was time to bring her voice back. The town didn't know it yet, but Briar Hill was closer than ever to learning the true story behind the forgotten grand piano. The next morning, the town was already buzzing long before the sun had fully risen. People seemed more awake than usual, as if some invisible thread connected them to the mystery that had begun unfolding around the old piano. It felt like everyone sensed that something bigger was happening, even if they could not explain what it was. The news of the discovered map and the strange melody had spread quietly but quickly. People talked about it in the bakery line, at the small gas station, and on the benches near the lake. Nobody knew the full story, only that something unusual had been found inside the piano, and it might be connected to the town's past. In the middle of all this, the group from the day before gathered again in the old hall. The dust had settled overnight, and the morning light made the worn wooden floor look almost golden. The piano sat exactly where they had left it, now feeling less like a forgotten object and more like the center of every unanswered question. The map they found was spread out on a long table. It looked older in the morning, light-aged paper, soft lines that seemed to fade at the edges, and small handwritten notes that were hard to read unless you leaned in close. Everyone stared at it with the same question. What was it leading to? One person traced a finger gently across one of the drawn paths. "It looks like it points toward the hills," they said quietly. Another pointed out a tiny mark near the edge of the map, a symbol shaped like a small sun. "Maybe this is a clue," they added, though no one knew what it meant. The air in the room felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. There was excitement, of course, but also a little nervousness. Whatever they were uncovering had been hidden for a long time. Someone in the past had placed this map inside the piano for a reason. They began planning what to do next. The map clearly needed to be followed, but no one wanted to rush into anything without understanding more. They decided to divide the tasks. A couple of people would try to decode the strange markings on the paper. Others would investigate the history of the piano, who owned it, how it ended up abandoned in the hall, and whether anyone had mentioned it in Old Town records. It was a calm and thoughtful plan. Though the excitement kept building despite their attempts to stay grounded. Later in the day, the group walked to the small local library. It was a quiet, warm place that always smelled like paper and old wood. The librarian welcomed them with a friendly smile, but raised an eyebrow when she saw the map they were carrying. "That looks like something I haven't seen before," she said. They explained what they had found in a careful, simple way, without exaggeration. She listened patiently and then led them to a section of Old Town archives, shelves full of thick books, newspapers, and handwritten journals. Everyone moved slowly through the material, flipping through pages, reading blurred ink, and sometimes stopping when a familiar name or date caught their attention. It took time, and for a while it seemed like nothing connected. But then one person found an old newspaper page from decades earlier. The headline was small and almost hidden, but the words made everyone pause. "Local family disappears after leaving mysterious a note." The group read quietly, each line drawing them deeper. The article described a family that left town suddenly. They had reportedly left behind only a note, saying they were going on a journey to return, something that belonged to everyone. The article also mentioned that the father of the family often played music in the town hall on a piano. The same piano. This made everyone stop for a moment. A new connection had been made, one that tied the map, the melody, and the piano together. What did they mean by something that belonged to everyone? Someone asked softly. Nobody knew. But it was clear that whatever the family had been trying to do, they had left clues behind. While some continued searching through the archives, others returned to the hall to examine the piano again. They felt there might be something else hidden that they had missed earlier. The sunlight was fading when they returned. The hall felt quieter now, and the shadows were a little longer. They opened the piano's lid again, not expecting much, but hoping they might find something. At first, everything looked the same as before. Then one person noticed a small metal hinge inside, almost invisible against the dark wood. They touched it gently, and the hinge clicked. A thin wooden panel loosened. Behind it was a small envelope, sealed but fragile with age. They stared at it, stunned. Nobody expected to find anything else, much less something hidden so carefully. Someone carefully lifted the envelope out. It felt light, almost empty, but they could hear a soft rustling inside. They took a deep breath and opened it slowly, making sure not to damage the paper. Inside was a small handwritten letter. The handwriting was neat but old-fashioned. The ink faded, but still readable. The first line made everyone freeze. "Whoever finds this, please know that the truth must not be lost." They read the rest in complete silence. The letter explained that the map led to a place the family believed held something valuable, not money or treasure, but something connected to the town's history. Something they said would help people understand where they came from. The last lines were almost haunting. "We hid this inside the piano because music is what brought people together. We hoped that someday someone would listen closely enough to the notes to find what we could not finish." When they reached the end, the room was still. Everyone felt the weight of the moment. The piano was no longer just an old forgotten instrument. It was part of a bigger story that the town had forgotten. They looked at one another. knowing the decision they faced now: follow the map completely, even if it meant walking into unknown places, or leave the mystery as it was. But after everything they had discovered, nobody was willing to stop. They knew they had to keep going. The day closed with quiet conversation. They agreed to meet early the next morning to begin their journey into the hills. It wasn't going to be dangerous. They were simply exploring, but there was still a feeling of stepping into something bigger than themselves. As night settled over the town, people walked home with thoughts they could not shake. Some felt excited, others felt nervous, but all of them felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: connection. The piano had somehow brought them together, not with music alone, but with a shared purpose. The quiet streets, the soft lamps glowing, and the cool air made everything feel peaceful. But there was still that sense of expectation lingering in the background, like the pause before a new chapter begins. In the hall, the piano waited. And the map, along with the letter, sat safely on the table, ready for whatever the following day would bring. Nobody knew what they would find in the hills, or what the family had meant about something belonging to everyone. But they felt closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The town, once quiet and ordinary, was now part of a mystery that had been waiting for generations to unfold. Tomorrow would change everything again. The next morning, the town of Briar Hill awoke to a soft mist that clung to the trees and hung over the fields. The air felt cool, but not cold, the kind of morning that made everything seem quiet, but full of anticipation. The town, which had been buzzing with curiosity for days, was now fully awake to the mystery unfolding around the old piano. People went about their usual routines, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Everyone seemed to sense that something big was about to happen, though no one knew exactly what. By the time the small group gathered outside the museum, the sun had begun to burn off the mist, leaving behind a clear sky. The map, the mysterious letter, and the hidden compartments in the piano were all they had to go on. It was time to follow the trail and see where it led. The plan was simple: follow the map into the hills. The path on the map seemed to wind toward a part of the forest just beyond the town's edge. A small group of them, the same people who had uncovered the piano's secrets, were ready to head out. They felt a mixture of excitement and nerves, but there was a sense of unity among them. They weren't just a group of curious people anymore. They were part of something much larger. The historian, who had been leading most of the research, felt the weight of the moment. She had never expected her quiet life of studying old town records and artifacts to take such an unexpected turn. The discovery of the piano and its hidden clues had thrown her into a story that seemed to span decades. Now, she was about to walk in the footsteps of the people who had hidden the piano and perhaps uncover what they had meant by something that belonged to everyone. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the sun was high enough to warm their faces, but the air still carried a coolness from the early morning. The group walked slowly, following the map's drawn path. The trees were thick around them, the branches of tall oaks and pines swaying gently in the breeze. The forest felt peaceful, but also alive with the promise of discovery. Each step seemed to carry them further from the world they knew. The town, which had been buzzing with conversation and curiosity, felt like it was fading away, replaced by the quiet hum of nature. No one spoke much as they walked, each person lost in their own thoughts. The historian couldn't help but wonder what the family who had hidden the piano had been like. What had they known? Why had they thought this place in the hills was so important? They came to a small clearing, and the map pointed to a spot not far ahead. There was no obvious marker, no sign, no monument, nothing to indicate this was the place. But the historian felt it. There was something about the way the trees opened up here, the way the light filtered through the leaves, that made this place feel different. She could almost hear the soft echo of something ancient in the air. They stopped and began searching the area. The group split up. some of them walking along the edges of the clearing, while others began to dig in the soft earth near the center. The historian stood still for a moment, looking around. Her eyes scanned the trees, the ground, anything that might give them a clue. Then, something caught her eye. There was a large stone, weathered and worn, sitting at the edge of the clearing. It looked out of place, larger than any of the other rocks in the area. And there was something about its shape that seemed deliberate, almost like it had been placed there on purpose. She walked over to it slowly, her heart racing a little faster. She crouched down and ran her fingers along the stone's surface. There was a faint marking on it, too faded to make out at first, but as she traced it, she began to see it more clearly. A symbol dot, it was the same symbol they had seen on the map, a small sun-like shape, with lines radiating outward. She felt a thrill of recognition. This was it. This was the clue they had been looking for. She looked back at the group and called out, "Over here." The others quickly gathered around, and together they examined the stone. The markings were faint, but unmistakable. There was no doubt now they were in the right place. One person knelt down to investigate further. "What do you think it means?" they asked, their voice low. "I think it's a marker," the historian said. "It's telling us we've found the spot." They continued to examine the stone, looking for any hidden compartments or signs of something buried. But there was nothing obvious. The ground around the stone was soft, and the area looked undisturbed. Another group member, a young man who had been quiet until now, stepped forward with a small shovel. "What if we start digging here?" he suggested. They agreed, and slowly they began to dig around the stone. At first, there was nothing, just the soft earth and a few tree roots. But as they dug deeper, the soil seemed to give way to something harder. A faint metallic sound echoed through the air. They stopped and looked at each other, eyes wide with anticipation. A few more minutes of careful digging revealed what they were hoping for. A metal box, rusted but clearly intact, was buried beneath the earth. They carefully lifted it out, brushing off the dirt and leaves. It was heavy, much heavier than they had expected. The historian felt a lump form in her throat as they set the box on the ground. It wasn't just a box. It was a chest, an old chest, bound in metal and marked with the same sun symbol that had appeared on the map and the stone. They opened it slowly, one of them taking the rusty lock off with a small tool. The hinges creaked as they lifted the lid. Inside, they found more letters, tattered but legible, along with several small objects wrapped in old cloth. The historian's hands trembled as she carefully pulled the letters out, one by one. They were written in the same handwriting they had seen before. The letters were dated from the same time period, and they described the piano again, the music, and the journey it had taken. There were also mentions of a larger plan, something that had been set into motion to protect something precious. She scanned the pages quickly, the excitement growing with each word. Then, at the very bottom of the chest, she found something else, something that nearly stopped her heart. A small, faded photograph. It was of a woman, young and smiling, standing next to the same piano they had found in the town hall. She was dressed simply, but her eyes were full of life. There was something about her expression that felt familiar, though the historian couldn't quite place it. But it wasn't just the woman in the photograph. It was the man standing next to her. The historian's breath caught in her throat. The man in the photo was holding the same sun-shaped symbol that had been carved into the stone. The map and the chest. This was it. The final piece of the puzzle. They had uncovered the story. The woman in the photograph was the pianist. The man was the one who had hidden the piano, the one who had left the town with the mysterious family. Together, they had created something that had been passed down through the generations, a legacy that had now been uncovered by those who were willing to listen. The historian felt tears well up in her eyes as she held the photograph. This was more than just an old secret. It was a story of love, loss, and a shared purpose that had transcended time. A group stood together in silence, each of them processing the weight of what they had found. They had come looking for answers, and now they had them. But the real question was, what would they do with this knowledge? The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a key to understanding the town's history and the lives of the people who had shaped it. The historian placed the photograph back into the chest and closed the lid gently. It was time to return to town, to share what they had uncovered. The mystery was over, but the journey had just begun. The journey back to town was quiet, filled with the weight of the discovery they had just made. The chest was now safely in their hands, but it felt as though it contained more than just objects and letters. It held the essence of a long-forgotten story, a story that had been waiting to be uncovered for decades. The group walked in a slow procession, their steps almost synchronized, as if they were all aware that this moment would change everything. The town of Briar Hill seemed unchanged as they made their way back through the streets. The old buildings, the quiet homes, and the familiar faces all looked the same as they had before the mystery began. But for those who had uncovered the secret of the piano, everything felt different. The weight of the past hung in the air, and the knowledge they carried with them now felt like a thread that connected the present with a forgotten time. When they returned to the hall, they carefully set the chest down in the center of the room. The piano sat in the corner, looking as unassuming as ever, but it was no longer just an old instrument. It was part of a bigger story, and now everyone in the town would know it as the group gathered around the chest. The historian felt a wave of emotion. She had always been drawn to the past, to the stories that people had left behind, but this was different. This wasn't just an old document or an artifact. It was a piece of the town's soul. The piano, the letters, and the photograph were all part of a deeper connection, a bond that had been lost but now had been found again. Someone in the group spoke first. "We need to share this with the town. Everyone needs to know what we've uncovered." There was a moment of hesitation, as if everyone was thinking the same thing. This was a story that belonged to the whole town, not just the small group who had stumbled upon it. But sharing it also meant revealing something that might change how people saw their town, how they saw themselves. "Do you think they'll understand?" someone asked. "I don't know," the historian replied. "But this is part of our history. It's something that has been hidden for too long." And with that, they made the decision. It was time to tell the story. The group spent the next few days preparing. They wanted to make sure the story was told right. The chest, the letters, and the photograph would be displayed in the town hall for everyone to see. They would invite everyone, families, elders, even the children, to come and learn about the forgotten history that had been buried under layers of time. The piano would remain in its corner, now a symbol of connection between past and present. As the evening approached, the townspeople began to gather. The hall filled with murmurs of curiosity. Some had heard whispers about what had been found, but most of them had no idea what the group was about to reveal. The historian, standing at the front of the room, looked out at the faces in the crowd. She felt a nervousness rise in her chest, but also a sense of pride. This was something important. This was the moment when the story would finally be told. She cleared her throat and began. It started with the discovery of an old piano, she said, her voice steady. An instrument that had been sitting forgotten in the town hall for years. But when we opened it, we found something much more than we expected. Inside, we found a map and a letter that spoke of something much bigger, something tied to the very heart of our town. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, everyone listening intently. We followed the map, and it led us to a place in the hills. There we uncovered a chest. Inside, we found letters, objects, and a photograph that told a story. The story of a family who lived here many years ago, a family whose music had brought people together, and who had hidden something important, something that belonged to everyone in this town. The historian then explained everything they had, discovered the mysterious family, the piano, and the significance of the symbol they had seen everywhere. She spoke of the photograph, the woman and the man who had been part of the family, and how they had left behind a legacy that had been passed down through generations. The townspeople listened in stunned silence. It was a story unlike any they had ever heard before, a story that connected them to a past they had no idea existed. There were whispers, nods of recognition, and a few tears in the crowd. The historian's words had opened a door to something they had never fully understood. "We don't know everything," she said as she finished her story. "But what we do know is that the piano, the music, and the family were all part of something bigger. They were trying to create a bond, something that would help people understand where they came from. And now it's our turn to carry that legacy forward." The room was still for a moment, as if everyone was absorbing what they had just heard. Then someone in the back of the room stood up. It was an elderly man, one of the town's oldest residents. "I remember," he said, his voice shaky but filled with conviction. "I remember the piano. I remember the music." The room fell silent again as the man spoke. He told the crowd about the days when the piano had been played regularly in the town hall, how the music had brought people together. He remembered the family who had once lived here, the family who had been so kind and so full of life. He talked about the piano as if it were a part of his own memories. "I was just a boy back then," he continued, "but I remember the way it felt when the music filled the room. It was like everything was right in the world. And then, one day, they were gone. Nobody ever knew what happened to them. But I always wondered." He trailed off, his voice heavy with the weight of years. The historian stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You weren't the only one," she said softly. "None of us knew. But now we do." The man nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. I'm glad that the story is finally being told." The crowd was quiet for a moment, each person processing the story in their own way. The historian looked out at the faces in the crowd, and for the first time, she felt a deep connection to them. The mystery that had been buried for so long was no longer just a secret. It was part of their shared history. And then someone in the back raised their hand. "What happens now?" they asked. The historian smiled, knowing that the answer was simple. "Now," she said, "we carry the legacy forward. The music, the story, the bond that was created all those years ago. We honor it by remembering and by sharing it with the next generation." As the crowd began to disperse, there was a sense of peace in the air. The mystery had been solved, but it wasn't just the answers that mattered. It was the way the town had come together to uncover the truth. The piano, once forgotten, had now become a symbol of connection, of history, and of the power of music to bring people together. The historian stood in the center of the hall, looking around at the faces of the townspeople. She felt a sense of pride that she had never known before. This wasn't just her story, or the story of the group who had uncovered the mystery. It was the town's story, a story that had been waiting to be told. And with that, the forgotten grand piano, once hidden in the shadows, had finally revealed its secrets. The town of Briar Hill would never be the same again. The mystery had ended, but the legacy would live on forever.